This is Duke University.
So it has been a long time since I talked to the public, and it's a pleasure to be again here. And I feel like I have a debt to pay because I feel our scholarship, our existence, our stories don't mean much without give and take between us, without this kind of, it's like, you know, the stones when they hit each other to create fire or light. And that's how it is between us and the world. We are part of it. It is part of us. And it's all kind of a hand-in-hand struggle. So I'm very happy. And I know a lot of faces, and it's an honor to see you. And those that I don't know, I'm very happy to see you here. But I want to start with, first of all, thanking the Center of Middle Eastern Studies, particularly Professor Miriam Cook, for her wonderful and kindness, dedication to the issues, and her commitment to bring a lot of the things that sort of have the potential to get lost, a lot of the stories, a lot of struggles, and I'm very grateful for her. And she's also, in addition to that, she's a very special mentor that I'm very grateful for the things that she have taught me over the years during my time at Duke. The other thing, I also, obviously, as you know, we are dedicating this to Yusur, Dia, and Rezan, the 3 lives that were cut short at UNC. And, but also, these 3 lives are just a drop in the ocean. So in addition to these lives, I want to dedicate this to all the lives who were lost in the Middle East, the refugees, the displaced people, those who died, who have a lot of stories to tell, the light of whose life was put out forever. And we will never know what they had to tell us. So it's been said, only the dead survive the war. Because if you survive, then you never survive it. It's over and over again in your head. You relive it all the time. And we dedicate it to all the people that we love and the people that we would have loved had we known them. So it's hard to start. The old Arabic song says, لو حكينا نبتدي منين الحكاية. If we tell our story, where shall we start from? And our dear old anthropologist Bateson says, where shall we start from? And there's a Swiss director who said, every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, but they don't necessarily happen in that order. So today, there will be some disorder because it's just not possible to do this kind of chronological style, and I will be jumping in events. I want to start with the memories of the first Gulf War. I was in primary school, and at the time, I had a very special love for animals, and the very first bomb that was dropped in where I was living at the time, which was Kirkuk, I was watching one of my dearest chicken laying her first egg. And as the egg came down, she was struggling. It was like giving birth for the very first time. And the first bomb was dropped in the first Gulf War. It was very much at the same kind of moment. And the chicken was startled. And she made a move that, as a child, I remember seeing that egg. It fell and broke. And I was so sad. I felt like a life was shattered in front of me to see that the very first egg of my special dear chicken. So that was the very beginning. And then after that, the electricity was off. There was no water. There was no food. And there was people running all over the place and fear. At the time in Kirkuk, it's a very sensitive area in Iraq. So there was all these ethnicities, and people were saying this ethnicity will attack if there is no order. People will kill each other. So we were torn between whether we should stay at home or we should just escape. And my father, at the time, was taken what they call the public army, al-Jaysh al-Sha'bi in Iraqi, and he was lost. We had no news where he was. So it was just my mother who was pregnant and the 6 of us at the time. Now we're 7. My sister was born 1991. So my mother was alone in all of this, and we decided that we will stay for a little bit. And I remember our neighbors at the time, they were from Najaf, the south city of Iraq, living in Kirkuk. And we used to go there to what we call in Iraqi dialect, like give heart for each other, hearten each other, support each other. And we would sit there at night and tell stories and talk, and they were very kind of special but difficult moments. There's something about these memories. I mean, they're difficult, but there's also something that is, unforgettable. I don't know if memory goes through plastic surgeries over time, but maybe distortion surgeries as well. Or plastic surgeries that don't work out, let's say. But there was also something special about those days. Anyway, as the bombing intensified and as the rumors started going around, my mother decided that we have to run out of the city and go northward. So we went to the north through Erbil and then Suleimania. We ended up at the Iranian border on a refugee camp. So I remember one of the things that I still remember was in Erbil, we didn't eat for almost like 2 or 3 days. And we were walking in Erbil, close to the outskirts of the city, all of us, with 2 other Christian families. I grew up in an Assyrian Christian family in Iraq, just to be clear about that. And it was a rainy day. I remember the mud, the rain. It was cold, and we were very hungry. So we got to what looked like a village, and we knocked on the very first door. It was a mud house, and a Kurdish woman opened the door at the time, and she was very kind. I still remember the way she was talking, with kindness, with love. And we said, we're gonna drop dead now. We just need anything to eat. And she said, in Kurdish, she said, I only have 2 breads, and I have tea but no sugar. She said, I'll give you 1 bread, and the rest is for me and my children. And this is tons of us, 6 children, my mom, and the other families. So well, the bread was like the dry, big breads they make back there, khubz rqaq, we call it in Iraq. So, and then she said, do you want tea without sugar? We said, definitely. It's very appropriate, given the circumstances, to drink it bitter. So I remember the laughters with the tea story, even in the middle of all this horror. To me, that was almost like a biblical story. This woman, she was a Muslim, a Kurd, and, she was giving from the little that she had, like when Jesus said, this woman gave more because she dropped very little because she gave from what she needed. So I feel like we always see biblical stories when you go around in this world. There's a lot of hatred and a lot of pain and a lot of violence, as we say, against this and that and the black and the white and the gay, and it's all, we say it's intersectional. But what I've also learned in my life, that love also is intersectional. Because we get love from very different multi-sections as we move around. So that is equally important for us to always keep in mind. So that was that. Then her neighbor said, I'll take you to Suleimania if you want to escape. There's no cars, no gas. And he happened to go to Suleimania, another city in Iraq. We went there, and these are all very long stories, so I'm really packing them, making them very short for you. Maybe one day you'll read them in a book or something. But in Suleimania, we stayed at a church that was taking all the refugees who were hungry. And I remember we stayed in one room, all of us, all these people packed in one little room. And the church would give you only, per family, 2 apples, 2 eggs, and 2 breads. That's all they could afford. And we sort of lived on that for a few days. And then people were saying, we got to go to the border because then there's refugee camps there. And we have, at the time, Iran had opened the Iranian border, which is one of the most beautiful areas as you go through mountains and trees. And, there's also one thing that I want to say in the middle of all of this. When you remember these sad stories and the pain, in the middle of that, I also remember the trees and the apricots and the apple trees and the senses and the smells of things. And that's why these stories remain dear. There's all fondness about them. It's not only pain, it's also that fondness of remembering the place. So we ended up at the Iranian border. Oh, before we went to the Iranian border, actually, there was a history professor who was a Kurd speaking to my mother, and we were hiding. There was a bombing going on, and we were hiding under one building with like hundreds, if not thousands, of families, all packed in the ground level of the building. And he said to my mom, I think we should get out of here because this bombing is very intense and we might just lose our lives. And my mother said to him, why would we leave? I mean, we are with all these people. Let's live with them or die with them. He said, woman, don't be crazy. This is really scary. Somehow he convinced us to all leave the building. And as we left, it became like sort of far distance, but still visible from us. I remember seeing the building collapse, the whole thing collapse. And since that day, I hate the word luck. I hate the word, I hate when people think that they are lucky, because I would never want to think that I'm luckier or more privileged than the people who died there. It changed my concept linguistically of what is luck and who is lucky and who is privileged. But also a lot of things that have been written about, or that if you survive the war, you really never survive it, as I said at the beginning. At the Suleimania border, we reconnected with that history professor and his daughters and his wife. And at the time, my father was lost, as I said at the beginning, so we were alone. And he said to my mother, okay, let's sign up. They're taking all these people to the Scandinavian countries. We might end up in Norway. And my mother said, I'm not going. He said, are you crazy? She said, I'm not going without my husband. He said, woman. I still remember how he talked to my mother. They became kind of friendly with each other. He said, woman, think carefully. If your husband is alive, he can join you. If he is dead, then there's no point going back anyway. My mom said, no, I got to know what happened to him. I'm not leaving. So they left, and we returned after the whole thing ended, and we returned by bus, little by little. And that was the first time I learned what it means to really love. My mom taught me a lesson in loving somebody when she could have saved all of us in a different way, but she chose that she would not leave without my father. So as we returned in the cities, like back the same path through buses and walking and this and that, we would hitchhike kind of thing, sometimes wait for ages in the garage until a bus comes, and people will run to it like crazy because there was no buses, no spaces, very limited kind of transportation. And I remember the first time I saw dead bodies in the street, and I was very young. So I was not scared, but I was very curious, what is this? So I left the group, my mom and my siblings, and I went and started just staring at the dead bodies. It was something very strange, like the face looked gray, there was blood all over. I just wanted to understand, what is this? And since that day, death have always been of interest to me. It has been part of, I live and die every day at once. And I say this, even in the scholarship, I strongly believe, because of this experience, that I don't want to live as in make living or a paycheck. I want to learn how to die as well. And that doesn't mean I want to commit suicide. It means that if we learn how to live, it's also learning how to die. We don't choose how we are born, but we may be able to choose how we die also. So that has really profoundly affected me in my life. One other thing I remember, when people were running, the tanks were bombing, and the soldiers and the whole mess, Peshmerga versus the Iraqi army, the Kurdish Peshmerga. My mother stood in the middle and she started screaming at the tanks. She said, don't you see these families? Are you crazy? What are you doing? That screaming is still in my head. And I remember when people were running, there's a woman carrying 2 children on her shoulders, which seemed to be her children, and she was the only one. And as she continued running, she couldn't carry them anymore. So I noticed her. She went on the side, and there was a hole. She put the children in the hole, and she kept running. And I was just so struck by that story. It kept me thinking for so long, like, did she really desert them? But as I grew older, I think she really didn't, in a way. Maybe she saved them in a way, because I really don't know. I mean, that's a question. We returned home after like a whole, long journey, and my father was there. He had returned, had his own stories, which I'm not going to go through too long. But I remember he went through villages, and people had fed him and took care of him, and he drank dirty water from the streams, and like people have deserted the public army, and one of the villagers gave him a pot of homemade yogurt, and he didn't eat it. He decided like he would come home and share it with us, given the circumstances. So I remember the joy of all of us sitting and eating that yogurt with my father at home, and my mother feeling happy that she knew that she was going back to something, to the person that she. So fast forward, the sanctions, living under the sanctions, and the pain and the suffering and the poverty and the hunger. Particularly in our family, we were 7. My family believed that we had to get education. So there were times when we had to eat 1 meal a day just so we can continue to go to school. I remember that a lot of people had to leave their school, even though schools were free, but they had to leave in order to just work. A lot of professors I remember my professors, my teachers, they had to do, at the time my teachers, I wasn't at university yet, they had to work as taxi drivers, do all kinds of menial jobs just to survive, or teach private lessons on the side, which was even hard to get. So fast forward to the American occupation in 2003. I was in Baghdad, an undergraduate student, and this whole thing started. And I was at the English department at the University of Baghdad, and a lot of the journalists from the world would come to us right away because they wanted somebody who can communicate. to see how we feel about the war that is coming again. This is the second Gulf War, the 2003. And I remember the department sort of not allowing us or not encouraging us to talk to the foreigners because it was kind of sensitive what to say, what not to say. And a lot of people were interested in me, following me, particularly because I remember a Swedish channel was trying to do a documentary about me because I was an Assyrian. And they have a lot of Christian minority in Sweden, as you know, immigrant community. And they're trying to see how I live, come from Kirkuk and go through this and stuff. So the university never gave a permission for me to go out of the campus to talk to them, I remember at the time. And the professor they put in charge of sort of watching me to see if I'm not saying anything against the regime or anything. She was a very nice professor, very wonderful woman, very smart. But they just assigned her to be part of looking over these interviews. She told me, Louis, please, I love you. Just say no, whatever they tell you. I don't want you to get in trouble. And I refused. So I said, if you want to talk to me, we can talk on campus. Otherwise, I'm not. They wanted to take me out to coffee or to, but at the time it was very heightened level of security and stuff. So I was third year when the war started. The university stopped. The school started. That was 2003. I returned to Kirkuk, and then the Americans came, the American soldiers. And at the time, because I was an English major, for me the whole thing was I just wanted to speak English. I didn't understand the complexity of war and occupation and all that. I just wanted to see these are native speakers of English. It'd be so nice. And here I am. I only know English through Jane Austen and Shakespeare, and it was. I remember the Americans made fun of my English at the time. It was very bookish and very proper. Today is not so much, as you noticed probably. So I went to the government building at the time in Kirkuk, and there were soldiers standing and people looking at them as this kind of these strangers, what they're doing. They're trying to understand each other. It wasn't hate or shock. It was just looking at something. It actually reminds me of Tolstoy. He has a beautiful line. He says, much of the great literature in the world is either a person goes on a journey or a stranger arrives in town. And I like that in so many ways, including, for us anthropologists, we are strangers arriving in different towns to do work and to understand the world. So this is when this happens and we start to understand things better. And so the soldier told me, I said, do you guys need my help? Can I help you with anything? He's like, sure, you can come back tomorrow. I think he was just trying to get rid of me or whatever. Come tomorrow at 11. He just gave a time. Now, tomorrow was Easter, and we went to church, and I sneaked out of the church to go to the appointment. That was my first appointment that I kept in my life. The first appointment that I had to take seriously, and I had to go. So I went to the back, and he wasn't there. They changed who's guarding the gates and whatnot. And I talked to another person, and I said to him, somebody told me such and such. He's like, I have no idea. Let me ask. And then they let me in, and I talked to the colonel at the time, who was the colonel in the whole city of Kirkuk. And, little by little, I started to start talking to them, and they said, you should work with us and help us, and, it's a cultural mission and all that stuff. And then this continued. There's a lot of stories with this, including the kind of things I got to see. I did mostly translation, interpretation, documentation. I worked a lot of civil things in banks and Chamber of Commerce, financial things. I worked with a civil team at the time. But towards the end, the team changed, and I had to do more of breaking into places. And they would ask people to hide their faces sometimes, which I refused. I said, I'm not doing something wrong. I either show myself or I take the risk. And that's when actually once, not in my experience, we ever found any weapons or anything to all the villages they broke into. And that's what sort of it had also a profound effect on breaking into somebody's life, into somebody's house, under all these kind of claims. That sort of started making me think more and more about what does it mean to be under occupation in your own home, it gets broken into and all things scattered, all that stuff. So there's a lot of those stories that are very difficult, and I don't think there's time to say. But I would say that one time I got threatened because I was with a mission who was doing that. And that was when I decided that this has to stop, because I no longer feel that it it is what I thought it would be. It's like, it was this naive thing that I want to be talking to others and helping and being a bridge between people who cannot otherwise understand each other. So that was sort of like when I decided I had to leave. And a lot of my friends got assassinated, including people who worked with the army, or I worked at the NGO also at some point, so some of my friends died. One of my dear friends, who was a Turkmen from Kirkuk, and he sat across the room from me in the same office, and he kind of was doing some paperwork when I applied to the Fulbright at the time to come here to the US. And he would send me an email saying, hey, Louis, you need to go do the TOEFL or do this and that. And by the time he finished doing the paperwork, like helping me as an employee, not as a friend, I heard that he was killed. So when I left Iraq, I felt, well, he was killed right after I left Iraq. So I felt like in a way that he was sort of saved me, but also, you know, it was one of the most difficult things. At the time, I still had him on Yahoo Messenger, and I remember he will never come online again. Because we used to talk a lot on Yahoo Messenger. That was my first introduction even to the internet as a whole idea. So there, I mean, so today I am interested in thinking about these issues. And you know, some people say, how do you feel about doing that? Do you, like, some people have asked, maybe I should leave it for the question piece, but like, do you regret working with the Americans? The answer is no, because this is precisely how we learn what is happening, how we learn the depth of it. Today, I can speak with much more confidence about these issues because I let life happen to me, and it happened. It's in front of my eyes. So, I mean, I can't, it's not just somebody saying they think this and that. It's not just a viewpoint. I went through it. I saw it in my own eyes day in and day out. So when I speak about it, when I think about it, I feel it has much more weight than not having been through it. So, you know, I think, you know, as George Sand, the French writer, says, you cannot tear one page out of your book, but you can throw the whole book into the fire. And I will not throw the whole book into the fire, and I will cherish every chapter of it. But I think translating with occupation, which is the title of this lecture, was very important. It wasn't translating just in the strict sense of the word. It was translation and interpretation particularly, which is the spoken thing. It's one of the rare moments when you have to let two people communicate in different languages without you ever making any value judgment about them. Because if you do, you will lose it. You will not be a good interpreter. So years of doing that taught me a very important lesson, how to listen to somebody without ever thinking in my head, oh, he's an idiot. She is stupid. Why are they saying? Because if I think like that, I lose it. Oh, the mic now comes. It's too late. You're hearing me anyway. So that was how translating also made me feel about when you talk, you just block your judgment and let the two people be. And then you reflect later. But that's one lesson in language. And I think it is very important for us to always hear refugees, hear others, read things in that kind of sense. It's like, first I want to read, and later I want to reflect on it. Like, give it some time. Let it speak. Let it come to life. And today I find that language comes alive. I mean, alive in every way possible. I find, you know, language has almost like a word is almost like a person in front of me sometimes. Even punctuation marks have characters like persons. Like period is very arrogant. I don't like the period. Even people who say period, that's so arrogant when they speak. I feel the comma is a little nicer, you know, comma, and then something is coming. It's allowing something else. Semicolon is even nicer. Wait, there's another part of me that's coming. So if I was a punctuation, I would be an apostrophe because I'm hanging in there. Thank you.
Before I open it up to questions, and I'm sure there are many, Professor Shalott, I wonder if you have some comments.
Thank you. This is really interesting. I have a question about the situation in Kirkuk, your hometown. The Kurds now claim that this is going to be their capital, not Erbil. And this city is unique in Iraq. It represents all Iraqis, majority Kurd, Turkoman, and Arab. And the Turkoman joined the Arab in fighting the Kurd out of the city. Now the Shiite militia moved in, you see, supported by Iran, in order to kick out ISIL. Do you follow the news there, the situation? What happened to the Assyrian the Christian there in Kirkuk?
I think all the minorities have been affected, like greatly there. And yeah, of course I follow, and I still have people and friends and some relatives there. So the Kirkuk I knew is that it was a very mixed place where everybody existed and lived. I grew up speaking every single day. At home was Aramaic, my mother language. We were not allowed to speak Arabic to preserve the language. We were even corrected if we bring another word like a Kurdish or Turkmen word into the mix sometimes, which happens. We go to school. And outside in the school, the education, you know, at that time was all Arabic, formal education, and English as a language that was taught at schools. And the friends were Kurds, Turkmen, and Assyrian, and Chaldean, and you know. So we speak those languages, and you get to know the people. You immediately look at a face and speak to them the language that they are. You get to know them in that way. So I look at the seller in the store, and I immediately speak Kurdish, or Turkmen, and so on. So that's how I knew it. But it seems like today, and this is one of the critiques, that there's a critique about the former Iraqi regime as like ultra-nationalist or evil or this and that. But today we're trying to create another tenfold more nationalist kind of division within Iraq, you know, like within Shia or the Sunni or the Kurdish place. So I don't understand why another ultra-nationalism that is equally, you know, not inclusive of others or other voices is better than something else, you know. So that is one of the things that I would say to that, if it answers your question. Yeah.
The other thing is about the diversity of the Iraqi citizen and the sense of being Iraqis first. You told me a story about your mother hosted by a Kurdish lady.
Yeah.
And this is the situation in the beginning. All Iraqis, they feel they are Iraqi citizens. Nobody dared to ask the other, are you Christian or are you Sunni or Shia? This is very impolite question.
Yeah.
And I remember in the first days, you see, I hosted 2 Christian families from my neighborhood.
Yeah.
I have a small grove or orchard 30 miles to the north of Baghdad. They are American citizens in Michigan now. Yeah. And when we came back after the war, after 1 month, they offered me to give me a letter from the church in order to migrate to Europe as a Christian. You see, this is the sense, you see, he touched on a Muslim lady, gave them 1 bread and kept 1. This is exactly what happened in the beginning or the first month of the war.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
My pleasure.
Question? I think the lady in yellow.
So as a Christian minority in a predominantly Muslim country, you have perhaps a unique perspective. The slogans in most Muslim countries that are, you know, placards that are held out and speech that is shouted out is always death to America, death to Israel, death to Jews. And as Christians in prior to the war versus post-war, can you comment on the rhetoric within your community who can't help but, I would think, but be influenced by the majority and their hatred? I mean, obviously, your feelings towards America are such you're here. So, but how about the part of the anti-Semitism, the death to Israel, death to Jews that is so pervasive? And can you comment if there was a change before the war in the Christian community versus after the war? And what is it now for the people you know that are still left behind?
I mean, the Christian minority, I don't think they, I mean, in the street, I don't think anti-Semitism was something you would see in the Iraqi streets, actually. It was something more, you would see only in some like certain parts of education in relation to the Palestinian kind of case. But day-to-day living, I mean, a lot of Iraqis, they would hear things or rhetoric, even on TV or this or that, they would dismiss it as propaganda. I mean, people knew that, but it was sort of like there's the general talk and there's the people how they actually think. So I didn't get the sense of much of that growing up, neither in my community nor in the other people, the other ethnicities that I've known actually. So today, I mean, I haven't been back in a while. but the people that I talk to still don't like repeat that. It's not the issue that they're talking about. I mean, now the talk is always about the war and the violence and the sectarian violence, and that's the kind of thing I hear. So I don't hear other rhetoric actually. So.
Other questions?
Kind of following on what this other gentleman said and what she just said.
Yeah.
Taking yourself back to the young child in 1990
Yeah.
as a young child. Sorry, I didn't mean to wave. And then the invasion period of 2003 and what have you. And then now, I guess going back in 2003 and now, what was the available resource for your folks to be aware of what actually was going on as opposed to what they considered propaganda? Who were they blaming for the tanks coming and the invasion and those kind of things at all three of those stages? That's kind of a rhetorical question, but it's just something to, you know, the threat, we have a threat now there in that area. There was one in 03 or what was perceived then, and then way back in 1990. So for 25 years, your area has been subjected to a lot of invasive, and are other folks more as knowledgeable as you are and aware of all of the components, or are they still being fed propaganda? And I guess that's where the question is.
Well, I think this is a misconception to even think that the Arab world in general, including Syria today, is people just they consume what they are dealt. I mean, people are they just not they simply don't do that. I mean, they think for themselves. It does, you know, they think their own script. There is their own, you know, versus the official script, you know, in the state. So, I mean, that has always been the case, even growing up. I mean, there was like state channels, TV channels, for example, but people always went to the radio and listened to all kinds of channels, the BBC or other channels, you know. I'm sure you can confirm that, you know, growing up. Even during the war, people listened to different visions and stuff. So I think, I think nobody is immune to propaganda in the world, in any country, including here, as you know very well. But the question is that, you know, I think that the more you go through difficult circumstances, the more you become to think carefully about it. So the more you're comfortable, the more you take it for granted, you know. And quite frankly, I think propaganda affects people here much more than it did in the Arab world. People in the Arab world are much more politically savvy, I would say, than they are here. Here, they don't care. Go to the bar, have a beer, it's over, you know. But there, because there's pain, because it's so real and so near and dear, you're losing somebody, you're like, there's war, there's bombs thrown. So people think and talk and discuss in the home, in certain spaces where people are relatives and families or friends. So I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah. Yeah.
Question?
Yeah.
Thank you, Louis. Just now you talk about the role of interpreter, and I'm interested in that aspect. You said a good interpretation would be one who listens to both sides. But as your topic suggests, is translating occupation. For the Iraqis, it's the invasion, occupation, but for the Americans, it's the salvation of the unliberal world. And it already convey different meanings. How do you enact your role as interpreter?
Right, yeah. Well, I actually think today, I think more and more Americans don't see it as liberation. Am I right in this? Or can you guys confirm? Because I see it all over the place. So I think that's kind of a done deal. People are sort of waking up to it. But I think the other thing is, when we say translating, I mean it in looking back and translating what happened. But I was actually talking about when you're interpreting as a profession, what do you learn of how not to make that value judgment? So that question also reminds me of another point that I wanted to make. The way of these concepts of liberation, of oppression, are very reductive. I've always been against them personally because they don't tell us anything. They seem so loaded and they tell us so much, but they really don't tell us. They're more misleading. When they say, for example, which is something, I study Iraqi academics who were expelled after the occupation, and you know they were under the Ba'ath system. So when we just say oppressive, even in Syria, oppressive doesn't tell anything. No regime is purely oppressive or purely loving and wonderful. Every regime, as we know through our dear Gramsci, seeks consent. It tries to win over people. And as our other dear old Foucault says, every regime is also productive. So to simply minimize things to that level, we are missing so much of the nuance. So when we say oppressive or liberal, according to whom? Who is deciding that? I mean, so Iraqi Bath was oppressive because it's tortured people, and the US doesn't torture people in Guantanamo, and Britain doesn't have a bad history, and on and on and on. So when we say to whom? Who are we connecting to in relation to whom? So that's when it becomes problematic, and that's when we have to think about it in a very different language rather than these reductive terms, I think. So people, yeah.
Can you elaborate about
عفوا في وحدة.
very brief
Sure.
question about the subtitle of your talk today, From Kirkuk to Camelot. This is the capital of
Camelot.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
is a legend, you see.
Yeah.
So does it mean that you are heading to the unknown, to the shoreless shore city? Where are you? Are you adrift in the ocean? Why you chose this legend? This is wonderful, you see, story of King Arthur Mordaunt.
Actually, very good, because I forgot to say that. The original was the journey from Iraq to Camelot. And Camelot was mentioned in a poem by Lord Tennyson. And it's about the Lady of Shallott who had a curse on her. And she was, this is something we studied in Baghdad that profoundly affected me. I still remember writing word by word as the professor was explaining it, and talked a lot about it with other friends. But Lady of Shallott had a curse, and she was imprisoned in this faraway castle, which is away from from Camelot, which is the city of love and life and joy. And so she's living in this isolated place that she cannot even see real people. She only sees the outside through the window reflected in a mirror. So not even directly through the window. And the curse requires that Lady of Shallott stays there and never moves. But the day comes when Lady of Shallott doesn't accept that anymore. And I think that is something that happens to all of us, wherever we're from. There's always, we feel something is here, something, we need to liberate ourselves from something. We need to turn from a caterpillar into a butterfly. And once you become a butterfly, nobody can convince you that a caterpillar is better for you. So that Lady of Shalott, one day, with all determination, decides she's going to leave this place no matter what the consequences are. And she does, despite the curse. And she takes that boat with her name on it, Lady of Shallott, and she tries to reach to the other part of the shore, which is Camelot, the city of Dawn. But she dies on her way. I mean, she dies as she gets there. So the price of what she did is dying. And I remember having a conversation with my friend in Baghdad at the time about, we felt under the embargo like Lady of Shallott, like there's a curse on us, we are between the walls. Because actually a lot of Iraqis and even scholars, they don't even like the word sanctions. They think of it as a blockade. Even linguistically, that's a different nuance, because blockade, you see what it means, right? It's like a very different than just saying sanctions. So Lady of Shallott gave her life to kind of break the curse, despite all of that. So I remember talking to my friends at the time, like, we are like Lady of Shallott under this blockade. We're blocked from the world, and maybe one day we have to sort of do, no matter what the curse, like act against the curse, even if we die. So, and yet, as you leave, you discover that it is home that lives inside you, not you inside it. And when there's destruction, wherever you go, you see it in front of you, in the hotel rooms, on the boats and planes, and wherever you get. So, I mean, that was the idea, is that, does Camelot exist, is the question that I want to bring up, that I think a lot of refugees really, and people who are displaced, think about. And I like to think that exile and refugee life opens up a lot of possibilities, but quite frankly, very honestly, I think a lot of people, including scholars, over-romanticize the possibilities that come out of it. And I like to think of it in kind of conflicting terms. For example, Goethe says, every person should have roots and wings. And exile allows us to put to test our wings. But also it is precisely because we have roots and something that we learned how to love a place, that we can love other places. So I'm not about the idea that if I love Iraq and I miss it, then I can't love any other place. The opposite is true. It's because Iraq has shown me so much love and care, and I've seen good things in it as well. Precisely because of that, I know how to love other people in other places. And I feel sad for Syria or for Sweden if it has a disaster in it, or anywhere in the world in that sense. But then Tagore, the Indian philosopher, also tells us to go to the other side of the coin. He says, removing a tree from its soil is hardly a liberation for the tree. So there's these conflicting ideas about what home is. And I always like to keep them together, sometimes without missing kind of on it, just saying, oh, wonderful possibilities, let's all become refugees, let's just leave. It's like it doesn't work like that in the real life. So yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Louis.
Sure.
You've spoken a lot about your experience of the occupation growing up in Iraq, of the first Gulf War and the Iraq War from 2003. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you've experienced the occupation since becoming a Fulbright student and beginning your PhD studies in the US, and how this different spatiality and the porousness or non-porousness of the media and the visibility or non-visibility of these issues has impacted your experience of that personal history. And if you could also speak to exile, which I know is a big theme in your dissertation research.
Right. Yeah, there's so much to say about that. I think my experience in America started in Iraq, because I worked with the US Army and I got to know people, and I got to know them as humans, not just as soldiers. I mean, day in and day out, living with them, seeing their struggles, seeing them crying, seeing them asking questions. What are we doing here? What is this about? That is when I realized that these people are perhaps equally duped as the other side, who thought about this as liberation and celebration in these kind of terms. And that was the beginning of the experience. And as I came here and I saw the distortions and misconceptions and all kinds of things that people talk about, I also saw that I started to see people not with the eye of anger and rage, but rather with, I would say, sympathy, although admittedly, there were a lot of moments when it was very hard, because you just hear all these misconceptions over and over again. You feel like you have to I started, where shall we start from with the opening of this talk? You always have to, even the question of where are you from was one of the most uncomfortable questions that I ever encountered. To this day, it's even harder now that I'm American, actually, because where am I from? Like, what should I say? Where should I start from? The story is too long to be told, and I mean, somebody wants an answer. If I tell you a short answer, it will not quench your thirst. So that happened over and over again. And one way I responded at the beginning is I gave a lot of lectures and talked to people in different places, churches, synagogues, and other universities. And a lot of people were really willing to understand and to hear what people of Iraq have experienced. So that was very healing in so many ways. The Algerian novelist Ahlam Mastaghanemi opens her novel, The Memory of the Flesh, with a line. She says, "We never recover from our memories. That's why some of us paint. That's why some of us write. And that's why some of us also die." And in that sense, I mean, that was a way of healing, to write and to speak to people. It's to remember and to forget at once, like now. You guys are giving me this wonderful project. So one reaction also I had after talking to people and going to public places, that I decided I also want to be in isolation. So there was a lot of isolation that helped me reflect and think, but also sort of avoid being part of the conversation, which I don't know if you can think about it as good or not. But I do believe more and more as I know more, as I feel more and think more, is that this division between public intellectual and the other intellectual writer is actually artificial. It's just almost, to me, like gay and straight or colored. Because if we take, I'm not going to become like our dear Bourdieu, who talks about the capital, the symbolic capital and the cultural capital that we supposedly have, intellectuals, if we do have it. I mean, I would take it further by saying that is only meaningful if we, so I would say the cultural capital and symbolic capital is in the eye of the beholder. And that is good news and bad news. It's bad news. Let's start with the bad news. It's in the eye of the beholder. If the administrators think of professors, they are not important. That's the beholder, right? But the good news is why we need to always be in touch with the reality, with people, with struggle, and write about it and think about it. And it's not opposed to rigorous to be in that. In fact, it really feeds rigor, in my view. The other side of the coin is that the public is also a beholder. And if they see that we are not in touch with them, we are not really there, then we lose their support, which is so needed more than ever at this moment, especially for humanities and social sciences. And you all know what I'm talking about. So, yeah. So, I mean, those experiences, there was talking, there was isolation. And then every time I'm isolated for long, and then I say, when somebody says, hey, can you come to us? Like, sure, you know, like, it's like charging myself and coming out of my shell. Oh, and it's been a while since I'm here, so, you know, I'm a little rusty today, actually. So, yeah, does that sort of answer you? Yeah. But I want to say one more thing. But for example, as a student, for me, an anthropologist, even so, for me, the field work is not only the sites where I go to, it is here. Because particularly if I think about exile, the classroom here, the way knowledge is taught and produced and discussed, and the epistemic, not to generalize and accuse everybody, but the epistemic violence, epistemic racism, and all kinds of things that we see, the way things are produced, that is to me a field work, is to understand as well. So I do see that as well, part of the thing, in my experience. So I've been doing field work for the last 3 years, and then I'm going to go to the field again soon.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank you for a very
Thank you.